In 1953, Oklahoma opened a new highway between Oklahoma City and Tulsa. There was only one problem with that. America already had a highway between Oklahoma City and Tulsa. Route 66, the most famous road in the country, lined with filling stations, cafes, and towns whose entire economies ran on the traffic going past them. It was continuous, it was paved, and it was free. The new road, 88 miles of it, charged a toll. Route 66 communities fought the project, for obvious reasons. Drivers paid anyway. They were not merely paying for better pavement, they were paying for something American motorists were about to demand everywhere, the chance to avoid everything along the way. No town centers, no stoplights, no farm truck pulling out in front of them, no Main Street. 3 years later, Washington finally funded that idea on a national scale, and Route 66 never recovered, which raises a much stranger question. How did a highway that Americans were eventually willing to pay money to avoid become the most famous road in the country in the first place? Because Route 66 was not built the way most people assume. When the government created it in 1926, large parts of this highway barely qualified as roads. To understand how that patchwork became an American institution and why the country outgrew it, start with the system that produced it. Chapter 1. A country with millions of roads and no system. In the early 1920s, the United States had roughly 2.5 million miles of road and almost no hard surface on any of it. Roads were built by counties, townships, and states for local reasons, to local standards, with local money, which worked until Americans started buying cars by the million and driving them between states. What filled the gap was private enterprise. Trail associations, the Lincoln Highway, the National Old Trails Road, and the Ozark Trails picked a path, gave it a name, sold memberships to the towns along it, and marked it with painted bands on telephone poles. There was no standard sign, no number, and no guarantee the route was the best road. It was frequently the route that paid. Cross 4 states and you might follow 4 different names and 3 different color codes. Washington's first attempt to help in 1916 put $75 million into state road building and spread it so thinly that almost nothing it funded connected to anything else. So in 1921, Congress changed the rule that mattered. The Federal Highway Act limited federal aid to a designated system of no more than about 7% of each state's roads, concentrated on primary routes that cross state lines, and paid it out on a matching basis, with the states putting up their share and doing the actual work. In plain terms, and this governs everything that follows, the federal government was not building a national highway. It was telling each state to pick its most important roads, connect them to the neighboring states, and take federal help paying to improve them. Stop subsidizing every township lane. Start building a network. But the construction itself stayed with the states, which means the quality of any national route was going to depend on 8 separate state budgets, 8 construction schedules, and whatever pavement each state already happened to own. Route 66's legendary inconsistency was not an accident of history. It was designed into the financing. By the mid-1920s, one layer was still missing. Nobody had agreed on which roads counted or what to call them. In February 1925, the Secretary of Agriculture appointed the Joint Board on Interstate Highways, state and federal officials, to collect the state's proposals and turn them into one network with uniform numbers and a standard shield a driver could recognize anywhere in the country. Even numbers ran east-west, odd ran north-south, and the round numbers ending in 0 were reserved for the most important east-west highways, which will matter shortly. Their system was approved by the American Association of State Highway Officials on November 11, 1926. And here is the part almost nobody knows. Receiving a U.S. number unlocked no construction fund whatsoever. The Bureau of Public Roads said so explicitly. No special money became available simply because a road joined the U.S. system. The number identified a road as important, Paying for it stayed exactly where it had been. The government built the network faster than it built the roads, which made those numbered lines on the map enormously valuable and turned the drawing of them into a fight. One Oklahoma highway commissioner understood the stakes better than almost anyone at the table. Chapter 2. Cyrus Avery builds a route on paper. Cyrus Avery was a Tulsa businessman who had spent a decade in the road business before the U.S. system existed. As early as 1916, he was promoting a named trail, the Ozark Trail, through Springfield, Tulsa, Oklahoma City, and Amarillo. And as an Oklahoma highway official, he pushed grading, surfacing, and bridges onto that corridor, which had a practical consequence. By the time the Joint Board sat down in 1925, Oklahoma had roads worth putting on a national map, and Avery had a seat on the board. He was arguing for a corridor he had already spent 10 years assembling. He was not alone. Missouri's chief highway engineer, B.H. Piepmeyer, and Illinois highway official Frank Sheets pushed the same diagonal from their own state's side of the line, and they were competing for a scarce resource. The states submitted far more mileage than the board could accept, so its job was as much subtraction as addition, and every town on the losing end knew what it was losing. This is the principle worth carrying through the rest of the story. On a road with no bypasses, traffic is money. Put the line through a town, and every long-distance traveler becomes a potential customer of that town. Put it one county over, and they become somebody else's. What the winners got, in practice, was consolidation of routes that already had names. The corridor that became Route 66 absorbed pieces of the Ozark Trail, the National Old Trails Road, and a string of state highways, and replaced their painted poles and membership dues with one number administered by highway departments. Now the important question, the one most Route 66 stories skip. Why this alignment? It was not aesthetic, it was logistics. The route started in Chicago, the largest rail, freight, and agricultural market in the interior of the country, and ran southwest to Los Angeles. Because it cut diagonally instead of following the grid, it linked hundreds of rural communities in Illinois, Missouri, and Kansas directly to Chicago, which meant grain and produce could move toward the market and manufactured goods could move back. It was also shorter than the competing Chicago to Pacific routes. It crossed essentially flat prairie, and it ran through a milder climate than the northern highways. Those advantages sound minor until you consider the vehicle. By 1930, trucking was starting to rival the railroads for freight, and a 1930 truck had weak brakes, marginal cooling, and limited power. Mountain grades burned brakes. Snow closed routes for days. Mud stopped everything. A railroad can afford a mountain pass because the rails are engineered around it. A truck driver cannot. Route 66 was not famous yet. It was useful, measurably, mechanically useful, and useful is what made the rest possible. But a useful line on a map creates winners and losers, which is why the number itself became a brawl. Avery wanted 60, one of the prestige numbers. Kentucky wanted it too, for a road that actually ran east and west, and Kentucky won. Washington offered Avery 62 as a consolation. He thought 62 was an insult to the highway, and the whole numbering process stalled for 6 months over it. It ended in a hotel. On Friday, April 30th, 1926, Avery and Missouri's chief engineer, B.H. Piepmeyer, were both in Springfield, Missouri, for a Rotary convention with Oklahoma's chief highway engineer, John Page. They sat down at the Colonial Hotel with the list of numbers nobody had claimed yet, 24 of them, and worked down the page. One jumped out, 2 syllables, double digits, and it looked good on a shield. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, they walked down to the telegraph office in the hotel and wired Washington. The line that mattered, they preferred 66 to 62. The other states agreed. The most famous highway number in America was the leftover that Avery settled for after losing the number he actually wanted. One of the strongest brands in the history of American transportation came out of a numbering dispute nobody won. On November 11, 1926, U.S. Highway 66 was approved. Chicago to Los Angeles, roughly 2,400 miles, 8 states. And it was deliberately laid over roads that already existed. That was the point. Minimize new construction. Open the route to traffic immediately. Illinois had already paved nearly its entire section before the number was assigned. The shields themselves did not go up until 1927. Approval, in other words, did not mean the highway was built. It did not even mean it was one highway. It meant 8 states were now responsible for turning their own share of it into something worth driving. And because Washington was not paying the whole bill, they were about to build 8 very different versions of the same road. Chapter 3. Building a highway that didn't exist yet. 3 years after Route 66 was approved, here is what one U.S. highway looked like. By 1929, an Illinois motorist was driving a Route 66 that was paved end-to-end. A Texaco road report that year found the highway entirely concrete in Kansas, about 66% paved in Missouri, and roughly 25% improved in Oklahoma. And across the roughly 1,200 miles west of there, outside California's cities, concrete had essentially not appeared at all, which produced a genuinely strange experience for a driver. You could roll west out of Illinois on continuous concrete, following the same shield, the same number, the same official U.S. highway, and end up on gravel, then dirt, then a rutted clay surface that turned to grease in the rain. Same road on the map. 4 different centuries under the tires. And some of the pavement Americans proudly called a national highway was almost comically small. South of Miami, Oklahoma, a 3-mile stretch of the original roadbed survives at 9 feet wide. Today, that is roughly the width of one traffic lane. It was built between 1919 and 1921, and when Route 66 was assembled in 1926, it was simply absorbed, 9 feet in all, because it was what Oklahoma had. On the eve of the mother road, less than 12% of that state's roads had a hard surface at all. So why was one national highway built to 4 different standards at once? Because building Route 66 was never one project. It was hundreds of them. Each state highway department picked its own. Crews widened lanes, cut down curves, replaced timber bridges, laid culverts, improved drainage, graded the roadbed, and, where the budget allowed, surfaced it with gravel, brick, or concrete. 8 states, 8 schedules, no single completion date. And the money was the constraint. Federal aid was available, but it had to be matched, and it did not cover everything. The early work of upgrading a road that already existed sat overwhelmingly on the state at an estimated $22,000 per mile. That balance did not shift toward Washington until 1933. Run that across 2,400 miles, and the delay explains itself. Tens of millions of 1920s dollars for one route, while every state had thousands of other miles demanding the same budget. It also helps to know that improved was a ladder, graded earth at the bottom, then gravel, then brick, then concrete at the top. A state could truthfully report its section as improved, while a driver would call it a dirt track with ambitions. And the states had to find their share somewhere. The answer arrived almost simultaneously with the highway: the gasoline tax. Oregon tried it first in 1919, and by 1929, every state in the Union had one. Drivers were now paying for roads by the gallon, which is what made the matching model work at all. But that arithmetic was not the same everywhere. Illinois had a dense population, a large tax base, and about 300 miles of Route 66 to worry about. Arizona and New Mexico had far longer distances, harder terrain, and far fewer vehicles to tax. Whatever else went into those decisions, the states facing the toughest construction were not the ones with the deepest pockets. Uniform identity, wildly non-uniform construction. The price of a network built through state governments instead of by the federal one. Improvement also kept moving the road. Straightening a curve or replacing a bridge often meant abandoning the old line and building a new one beside it, which is why the original Route 66 exists in several versions in the same county. Which created the next problem. A highway only generates value if people use it, and in 1927, much of this one was not worth driving. So the states and towns along it founded the U.S. Highway 66 Association and started advertising a road they had not finished. They branded it the Main Street of America and promoted it as the shortest and best route from Chicago to Los Angeles. Then, in 1928, they backed something less subtle, a foot race across the United States. 199 men left Los Angeles bound for New York, 3,423 miles following Route 66 as far as Chicago. Newspapers called it the Bunyan Derby. 55 finished. A 20-year-old Cherokee farm boy from Foyil, Oklahoma, named Andy Payne won the $25,000 prize and used it to clear the debt on his family's farm. It worked. The number 66 was suddenly in newspapers nationwide. But publicity cannot pave 1,000 miles of road. What finally paved it was the collapse of the American economy. From 1933, federal relief programs poured labor and money into roadwork at a scale ordinary matched aid had never managed. Thousands of unemployed men went to work grading, surfacing, and bridging highways, Route 66 among them. The depression that emptied out the farms is also what completed the road the farmers were driving on. By 1938, Route 66 was continuously paved from Chicago to Los Angeles. 12 years after it was given a number, it finally became the all-weather highway the number had always implied. And, almost immediately, traffic began proving the road was worth far more than its designers had estimated. Chapter 4. Why Route 66 won. The clearest evidence is freight. The Illinois Motor Vehicles Division counted trucks on the Chicago to St. Louis stretch, roughly 1,500 a day in 1931, about 7,500 a day a decade later. A five-fold increase in 10 years, with a quarter of them tractor-trailer rigs. Avery's four arguments, distance, terrain, climate, Chicago, had just been confirmed by the freight industry with its own money. And the advantage over the railroad was structural. Rail could only serve places with track and a depot. Load a wagon, haul it to the station, transfer the freight, ship it, transfer it again at the other end. A truck could back up to a barn, drive to a warehouse in Chicago, and unload once. Fewer handlings, no fixed timetable, and it could go anywhere the road went, which after 1938 was everywhere between Chicago and Los Angeles. Farm goods moved toward the market. Manufactured goods moved west, and hundreds of small towns that had been agricultural backwaters found themselves sitting on a national commercial artery. Then the same road took on a second kind of traffic nobody had planned for. As drought and foreclosure pushed families off the southern plains, Route 66 became the main westward channel out of Oklahoma, Kansas, Texas, and Arkansas, because it was the shortest paved route to California, and it pointed in the right direction. In 1939, John Steinbeck called it the Mother Road in The Grapes of Wrath, and the phrase stuck to the highway permanently. That matters for an infrastructure story in one specific way. A federal route number acquired a national identity. From that point on, Route 66 was not merely a corridor. It was a brand, one that would eventually outlive the corridor's usefulness. And traffic of both kinds produced something else. The roadside economy. This is where nostalgia comes from, and it is worth being precise about the mechanism. Route 66 had no controlled access. Businesses fronted directly onto the pavement with their own driveways. Local traffic, farm traffic, trucks, and cross-country tourists all shared the same two lanes, and the route ran straight through the middle of every town on it, stoplights included. Which means every long-distance traveler physically passed the front door of every business on the road. Through traffic was not a marketing opportunity. It was a resource delivered by design. So the resource got harvested: filling stations, garages, cafes, tourist courts, curio shops. Entry costs were low: a pump, a griddle, a few cabins, and a good location, and the customer flow was continuous. The catch was that a driver at 45 miles an hour gives you about 3 seconds to make your case, and the competing business is 1 mile ahead offering the same thing. That single constraint explains the entire look of Route 66. Enormous signs, neon, that could be read before the words could. Buildings shaped like teepees and coffee pots. Promises about the world's largest anything. In Seligman, Arizona, a railway worker named Juan Delgadillo built a drive-in out of scrap lumber from the rail yard and parked a roofless 1936 Chevrolet in front of it because he could not afford to be beautiful and could not afford to be missed. The kitsch was not decoration. It was competitive advertising forced by the road's geometry. But the usability of a highway is not only pavement, and one group of Americans could use the road without being able to use what stood beside it. Black motorists could drive Route 66. They could not assume the motel would rent them a room, the cafe would serve them, or the filling station would let them use the restroom, and roughly half the counties along the route contained sundown towns. So a second layer of infrastructure grew on top of the physical one: the Negro Motorist Green Book, published from 1936, listing the businesses along highways like this that would actually take their money. Think of it as an information network laid over a transportation network to make the transportation network usable. Sites like the Threat Filling Station outside Luther, Oklahoma, black-owned, on family land, on Route 66, were nodes in that second system. And the Smithsonian's Green Book research notes what the gaps cost. With so few places willing to house black travelers, some drove far past exhaustion and died in accidents that segregation caused. Then the war arrived and stress-tested everything. Military bases and defense plants expanded across the Southwest and California, pulling workers from across the country to staff them. Mile-long convoys moved troops and equipment along Route 66 because the geography that had suited truckers in 1935, short, flat, open in winter, suited the Army for exactly the same reasons. Federal studies during the war found trucks carrying at least half of all defense material headed to production plants. The road passed the test. It also failed a different one. Narrow pavement, old bridges, undersized culverts, and 1920s design speeds were now carrying military axle loads and continuous freight, and the wear showed. Route 66 had proven that America needed national highways. It had also proven that America needed better ones than Route 66. Chapter 5, The Golden Age, contains the failure. Then came the traffic that made the road legendary. Car production restarted after the war and did not slow down. Around 1945, the United States had roughly 25.8 million registered automobiles. By 1955, it had about 52.1 million. The country doubled its cars in a decade, gasoline was cheap, and paid vacations were spreading through American contracts for the first time. All of that went on to the existing highways, and Route 66 got the version of it that faced the Southwest. The roadside economy scaled up accordingly and produced the images people still carry. Tourist courts became motels, with a pink vacancy sign that came on at dusk, and a second sign advertising the pool. Attendants in uniform who checked your oil and washed the windshield, then handed over a free road map printed by the oil company. Diners where the coffee arrived before you asked. Rock shops and reptile farms teasing you 100 miles in advance. In 1946, Bobby Troup wrote a song that was essentially a list of towns along the route. Nat King Cole recorded it, and the highway acquired a soundtrack. Then the name outgrew the road. In 1960, CBS premiered Route 66, a series about two young men crossing America in a Corvette. It ran for 116 episodes, shot on location all over the country, and only occasionally anywhere near the actual highway. That did not hurt the title at all. which tells you how far the brand had traveled. By 1960, Route 66 no longer meant a specific line between Chicago and Los Angeles. It meant the American road trip itself. The neon, the free maps, the motels, and the roadside attractions existed because travelers had to pass through these towns. On a road with no bypasses, that is how you compete for a customer already parked in front of your building. The song and the television show came later, after that roadside world had become famous enough to stand for the American road trip itself, which is precisely why the Golden Age was also the beginning of the end. Look at the same road as a transportation engineer in 1950. 2 lanes with opposing traffic separated by a painted line. Driveways every few hundred feet. Farm equipment pulling out. Crossroads at grade. Stoplights, crosswalks, and 25-mile-an-hour limits in every town center. Long-haul trucks stuck behind local traffic, and both of them stuck behind a family looking for a motel. Run the trip end to end, and the design shows itself. Chicago to Los Angeles meant passing through the middle of something like 100 communities and stopping constantly for lights, crossings, trains, tractors, tourists braking to read a sign. The pavement could handle 60 miles an hour. The route could not, and 2 lanes put oncoming traffic 4 feet from your elbow at a combined closing speed over 100 miles an hour. The head-on collisions killed Americans in numbers that made the design itself look indefensible. Stretches of the road were nicknamed Bloody 66, and the nickname was earned. And notice the timing. The roadside economy was at its richest in exactly the years the highway was at its worst, because both conditions had the same cause, which was more traffic than the road was built to hold. Here is the trap. The features that made Route 66 commercially valuable, direct access, town centers, continuous frontage, mixed traffic, were the exact features that made it slow, dangerous, and incapable of carrying the volume post-war America was generating. Its greatest economic strength and its greatest technical weakness were the same thing. The states could see it, and they tried to fix Route 66 within the old model. Illinois widened long stretches to 4 lanes. Other states straightened curves, added lanes, and rebuilt bridges. It helped with capacity and not much with safety, because the fundamental problem was not lane count. It was that anyone could enter or cross the highway anywhere along it. Which brings us back to the toll road. Oklahoma demonstrated the alternative before Washington did. Unable to wait for federal money, the state financed the Turner Turnpike with bonds and opened it in 1953. 88 miles from Oklahoma City to Tulsa. Limited access, no towns, no crossroads, running parallel to Route 66 the whole way. Now, the paradox. From the beginning of this story resolves into simple engineering. The towns objected because they understood exactly what was being sold. Drivers paid because a road with nothing on it was faster than a free road with everything on it, and because the free road's greatest asset, all that commerce packed against the pavement, was the thing slowing them down. Given the choice between a free highway through a dozen main streets and a tolled highway through none, long-distance traffic went around. Federal planners had already worked out what the replacement should look like on a national scale. What they did not have was money. Chapter 6. The system that replaced it. The case was made first as national defense. In 1941, Thomas McDonald, who ran federal highway policy for decades, and his planners identified tens of thousands of miles of defense-critical road that could not carry the loads being put on them. Their answer was not to widen existing highways. It was a purpose-built network of express highways connecting major cities directly. In 1944, Congress agreed, on paper. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1944 authorized a national system of interstate highways of roughly 40,000 miles. It did not provide the money to build it. So America now had a designed replacement for Route 66 and no money to build it, the same trap Route 66 had fallen into in 1926. A network existed in law. The pavement did not. The 1952 Highway Act finally attached specific interstate money, about $25 million a year for 2 fiscal years. Against a 40,000-mile national system, that was a rounding error. Everyone agreed the country needed the road. Nobody had solved how to pay for it. That is what changed on June 29, 1956, in a hospital room at Walter Reed, where a recovering president signed the Federal Aid Highway Act. The scale is worth stating slowly because it is the answer to everything the previous 15 years had failed to solve. Roughly 41,000 miles of new highway authorized as a single national system. About $25 billion of federal money committed over 13 years, at a time when the entire federal budget ran near $70 billion a year. And the number that made states move: Washington would pay 90% of the construction cost of every interstate mile. The states paid the remaining 10th. Compare that to the deal Route 66 was built under, where a state typically had to find $1 for every federal dollar and then hope its legislature kept finding them for a decade. Under the new arrangement, a state that declined to build was turning down $9 of somebody else's money. A companion revenue act funded it through a trust fund fed by highway user taxes. The federal gasoline tax went from 2 cents a gallon to 3. So the program was no longer competing every year against every other federal priority. Money came in from drivers and went out to interstates automatically. And one of the first places the new money went was almost too perfect. On August 2, 1956, shortly after 10 in the morning, the Missouri State Highway Commission awarded a $1.1 million contract to lay 13.3 miles of concrete pavement on US 66 in Laclede County. The federal district engineer telephoned Washington to confirm what everyone in the room suspected. It was the first interstate contract awarded anywhere in the country under the new act. The road being rebuilt would become part of Interstate 44. 5 weeks after the law was signed, Route 66 was already being paid to build its own replacement. Design standards, meanwhile, were national and mandatory, and sized not for the traffic of 1956, but for what engineers projected for 1975. Route 66 had been assembled from whatever the states happened to own. The interstates were specified before they were built and specified identically in every state. Put the 2 generations side by side because this comparison is the whole story. Route 66's generation: existing state roads, connected under one number, improved project by project, on roughly equal matching, with no dedicated fund and no single purpose-built facility engineered to one specification end to end. The road followed the state's capacity to pay. The interstate generation: purpose-built roads, uniform national engineering, a dedicated multi-billion-dollar revenue stream, and a 90-10 split no state could rationally decline. The road followed a federal plan. That financing difference is why one system took 12 years to pave 2,400 miles. And the other rebuilt American long-distance travel in about 2 decades. And the money did not only build roads faster, it bought engineers something Route 66 had never been able to obtain at any price: the removal of everything touching the highway, opposing traffic behind a median, entry and exit only at ramps, no driveways, crossroads carried over or under so there is nothing to stop for, no main streets. Every one of those improvements was also an attack on Route 66's economy. No driveway access meant a business could no longer capture traffic simply by existing beside the road. Grade separation meant no town could collect traffic simply by being on the way. Controlled access replaced continuous discovery with a decision made once at an exit, which strongly favored names a driver already recognized. The Park Service notes that interstate construction coincided with the rise of branded gas stations, chain motels, and franchise restaurants. The industry was already consolidating. The design accelerated it. When a driver has to commit to an exit in advance, a familiar sign is worth more than a good one. And buying familiarity nationally was not something a family operation on the old highway could do. The interstate was better because it eliminated friction. Route 66's entire commercial ecosystem was built out of that friction. From that point, the question was no longer whether Route 66 would lose its traffic. It was which town would lose it next. And the slow rollout made that worse. The bypasses did not arrive everywhere at once. A motel owner could watch a town 200 miles east lose its traffic in a single afternoon, then look at the highway department's construction schedule and work out roughly which year her own turn was coming. The replacement came corridor by corridor. 5 interstates absorbed Route 66's function over 3 decades. Interstate 55 from Chicago to St. Louis, Interstate 44 on to Oklahoma City, Interstate 40 across the Southwest, and Interstate 15 and Interstate 10 taking the last run into Los Angeles. The Park Service reports that by 1960, each Route 66 state had already spent somewhere between roughly $14 million and $20 million building its portion. You can watch the economics work in individual businesses. The Big Texan Steak Ranch opened on Route 66 in Amarillo in 1960. When Interstate 40 came through the Panhandle, it moved, reopening on the interstate in 1971, surviving by abandoning the road that created it, because the customers were always the business and the highway was only the delivery system. A restaurant can relocate 2 miles. A town cannot. And the ones left behind had no move available. These businesses never had loyal customers. They had passing ones, and a bypass did not shrink that market. It removed it. Seligman, Arizona had about 9,000 vehicles a day passing through and 12 gas stations to serve them. Interstate 40 opened 2 miles south on September 22, 1978, and by the account of Angel Delgadillo, the barber whose shop sat on the strip, the traffic did not taper off. It stopped. Nothing was destroyed. The road, the buildings, and the signs all remained. The strangers were simply somewhere else, at 65 miles an hour, 2 miles away. Route 66 was not killed by Americans driving less. It was killed by Americans driving more than ever on a system built to carry them better. Chapter 7. Taking the number off the map. The old highway died in pieces over 30 years, one bypass at a time. As each interstate segment opened, the parallel stretch of Route 66 was handed back down the hierarchy, a loop into town, a state route, a service road, a city street, or nothing at all. By 1970, Interstate 55 and Interstate 44 had absorbed most of the through traffic in the east and center, and Interstate 40 dominated the west, which created an administrative problem that is easy to overlook and entirely rational. A U.S. route number is supposed to identify a continuous through route. By the 1970s, Route 66 no longer was one. It survived as disconnected fragments, much of it duplicating an interstate running alongside it. So the designation came off the map state by state as each finished its replacement, starting with Illinois in 1974 and California in 1979. Each time the number came down and the pavement stayed, renumbered as a state or local road, which left one town holding the last piece. Williams, Arizona had fought its bypass through court case after court case, longer than anybody, and dropped the suits only when the state agreed to build 3 interchanges into town. The last 6 miles of Interstate 40 opened on October 13, 1984, and Williams became the final Route 66 town to be bypassed. The town threw a party for it. Around 500 people gathered at the new Grand Canyon Boulevard interchange. There was a parade on the interstate itself, and the Chamber of Commerce made sure the press was there, which is how a small-town road opening ended up on the BBC and the American Network News. And Bobby Troup came. The man who had turned this highway into a song in 1946 played it at the ceremony that ended the highway's working life and added Williams to the list of towns in the lyrics. What the news reports noted that week was the engineering milestone underneath the ceremony. From that day, you could drive from Chicago to Los Angeles without stopping at a single traffic light. 8 months later, on June 27, 1985, the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials met in Duluth, Minnesota, and voted to eliminate the designation entirely. Crews went out and replaced the shields with state route markers. It is worth being precise about what was and was not lost that day. Decommissioning removed a designation, not a road. The pavement still existed and still had an owner, a state, a county, a city, and most of it stayed open. What ended was its status as part of the national through road network, along with the one thing the towns actually needed, the guarantee that long-distance traffic would be routed past their doors. The verdict is not sentimental. The 1926 U.S. highway system had been a genuine breakthrough. It took hundreds of locally built roads and made them behave for the first time like a national network. 59 years later, the transportation function of its most famous route had been fully absorbed by a better engineered, better funded system, and the number no longer described anything a driver needed. Route 66 was not deleted because it was forgotten. It was deleted because it had been replaced. Chapter 8, The Afterlife, and then the value reappeared somewhere nobody had been measuring. Traffic returned to parts of Route 66, not because it had become efficient, but because it had stayed inefficient. That started with travelers, not officials. People began deliberately seeking out the obsolete road, the old alignments, the surviving motels, the towns the interstate had made invisible, and the businesses left behind noticed the demand before anyone in a capital did. Bypass town owners organized, the first association forming in Arizona in 1987, and lobbied their states to sign the old route as Historic Route 66. All 8 states eventually did some version of it, and the federal government followed the traffic rather than leading it. A study act in 1990, then a National Park Service preservation program in 1999 for the buildings, signs, and road segments still standing. And eventually that second life became measurable. A 2011 Rutgers University study carried out with the National Park Service and the World Monuments Fund put direct Route 66 related spending at roughly $132 million a year, about $262 million in total economic activity, and some 2,400 jobs. The preservation campaign had not been sentimental. A corridor declared obsolete in 1985 had built a working economy out of its obsolescence. That story also reached a much larger audience sideways. The premise of a small town made invisible by an interstate became familiar to millions of children through cars, whose radiator springs was a composite of Route 66 communities, the same bypass economics in animation. And what survives is not a highway. It is fragments, main streets, old routes through town, county roads, strips of pavement beside the interstate, and 1930s concrete that ends at a fence. Much of the original mileage is still drivable, if you are willing to keep leaving the fast road to find it. The mechanism is the same one that built the roadside economy in the first place, only running in reverse. Driving the old road forces you to pass through town centers, stop at lights, use local streets, and encounter businesses that face directly onto the pavement, the exact interactions interstate engineering was designed to remove, because those interactions slow transportation down. The trade-off runs both ways. The interstate is measurably better at moving people. The old road is better at putting them in contact with the places in between, which is why travelers now leave a 4-lane highway on purpose to drive 2 lanes of 1930s concrete running parallel to it, including a steady flow of visitors from Europe and Asia who fly to America specifically to do it, and who are looking for the friction rather than the destination. Finally, Route 66 was never one road in the modern sense. It was America's first serious attempt to make hundreds of locally built roads behave like a single national transportation system, assembled from what already existed, funded by matching state money, and improved unevenly over 12 years by 8 governments with different budgets. And it worked, well enough to carry the freight, the migrants, the war, and the vacations, and to generate an entire small business economy out of nothing but the fact that traffic had to pass by. Then its own traffic exposed everything the design could not do, and America solved that problem the way it had failed to solve it in 1926 and 1944. With dedicated money, uniform engineering, controlled access, and 90% federal funding. Route 66 did not lose because Americans stopped wanting mobility. It lost because the country became too mobile for a highway built to standards from the 1920s through the middle of every town on the way. The interstate was built to make the country smaller by cutting the time between 2 places. Route 66 had made the country larger by putting everything between those places directly in the traveler's path. Which brings us back to Oklahoma in 1953, and drivers handing over money at a toll booth for the privilege of avoiding the towns, the stoplights, the driveways, and the businesses that Route 66 had put in their way. 70 years later, travelers leave the interstate on purpose, some of them having crossed an ocean to go looking for exactly those things. Route 66 became obsolete because America learned to move faster. It survived because speed turned out not to be the only thing people valued about traveling through America.